30 years ago, Venezuela had a problem in its history in the continent. After bonanza came from times of shortage, and the government of the time did not find a better idea than to ask for an international rescue in exchange for privatizations, adjustment to the people, and stopping national sovereignty, even if his campaign had said the contrary. Simple people that had endured very harsh social economic conditions did not tolerate anymore and went out to the streets. This was the germ that what we now know today as Bolivarian Revolution that capitalized that malaise through a proposal of building a sovereign nation of equals. This has, in spite of systematic attempts of asphyxiation, has remained. How rebellions in other countries allowed the succession of leftist countries that reconfigured the continent. Venezuela, 30 years after the Caracazo, a revolution and resistance. This is our critical move today. We will look at news, historic events, and actors involved. The images in history have an undisputable expressive force. Caracazo was a sound proof that the people is not passive per se, and that political organizations of the time had no control. They never admitted their responsibility. And at the same time, according to what we said on February 16, we started applying corrections at the prices in national products, a commitment that we have with the country and not with the IMF. I will never forget Caracazo and what that meant, because it moved the foundations of Venezuela. And Caracazo was undoubtedly, to use this old expression, it was the spark that put fire on the hills. Caracazo was the spark that started the engine of Bolivarian Revolution that is here today, marching with you. On February 16, 1989, the newly president of Venezuela of the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez of Acción Democrática, publicly presented a program of macroeconomic adjustment containing a series of measures of immediate application and others gradual in terms relatively fast. Those measures are contained in the exchange policy, foreign debt, the financial system, including fiscal policy and social policies. This was aimed to ask the IMF $4.5 billion dispersed in the next 3 years. Among the measures announced to the country on February 1989 by President Carlos Andrés Pérez was liberation of prices of all products except 18 of the basic basket, increase of public transportation fares by 30% starting February 27, the increase of gas prices and oil byproducts by 100% in gas that became effective on February 26. Gradual increase of fees for utilities, telephone, water, gas, electricity. Deregulation of interest climbing to 30%. Elimination of preferential currency exchanging rates. All transactions abroad would be made at the new floating rate. Progressive elimination of trade travel. Hiring freeze in public administration. Privatization of state-administered companies. companies, privatization of state-administered companies, reduction of fiscal debt and more than 4% of the gross territorial product, with the supervision at IMF that should verify that adjustments were faithfully complied for disbursements. The actors were mid-class and popular people, working class, working leaders, cultural leaders, and community leaders. Actions. The malaise was such that it led to public transport and private transportation to be pillaged and pillaging of small stores that were not selling products like milk, sugar, sardines, sugar, coffee, and flour. The epicenter was to the east of Caracas in Guarenas. Government ordered brutal repression. We don't have an exact number of death and wounded, although conservative figures talk about 3,600 that were buried in common graves. In February 1983, the Black Friday 74% currency devaluation was decreed, extremely high social inequality. This fact was recorded in history as we said, the Black Friday. The loss of trust in government institutions. All this happened among the people, the lack of credibility in public authorities and economic agents. Consequences. By March 13, 1989, around 10,000 layoffs had occurred. In December, contracts economy by 8.1%, the highest recorded in Venezuelan history. Poverty, 62% of the population lived in poverty, and the government had to resort once again to international loans and accepted with $4 billion with the World Bank and IDB $300 million more. This was the beginning of the dawn of the Bolivarian Revolution with Hugo Chavez as the commander. Today, that people that rebelled that year against neoliberal measures of Carlos Andrés Pérez is confronting progressive wasted out sectors, psychological, political, economic, social, diplomatic. They are trying to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution. In this sense, Correo del Orinoco on February 26 published that Arreaza reports mobilization of U.S. troops in Caribe and the purchase of weapons for the opposition. In the session of UN Security Council, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela accused that his country was victim of international aggression and warned that the government had received information of friend countries like Russia and Cuba, whereby there are U.S. military troops mobilizing in the Caribbean and that they are purchasing in weapons in East Europe. This is the scenario of a military intervention. And then Arreaza wondered what was the South Command head with the chief of the armed forces in Bogota. How come militaries of other countries meet to talk about humanitarian aid, or so they call it? I will now go to our own home webpage of this state. Economic plan of the opposition could take Venezuela to another Caracazo. An exhaustive proposal of the Venezuelan opposition has been made in a document, Nation Plan. And we have warned the similarity with the neoliberal agenda of Carlos Andrés Pérez that ended in what we are reviewing now, Caracazo. This agenda for Venezuela's recovery includes a strategy of international financing, elimination of exchange rate adjustment in fuel prices and public service tariffs, suppression of social programs that are called social control policies, allow private capital investment in state companies. Isn't this privatization? Remember the map we just showed? Well, this is why Telesur placed this title, economic plan of the opposition that could take Venezuela to the Caracazo in these days. Misión Verdad is authored by Bruno Scarsini, Argentinian who lives in Venezuela. On June 21, 2016, we are interested in this data, the forgery of Caracazo of the new coup method. Scarsini talks about how the conventional concept of revolution has been kidnapped and manipulated by the global oligarchy to give it a popular nature to counter-revolutionary coups. For example, more than 10 years ago, they instaured the so-called colored revolution in former socialist Soviet republics, let's remember Yugoslavia and the Arab world. More recently, in Latin America and Caribbean, they are using that method with variants of the so-called white hands and similar. This is interesting data to analyze with our guests. Another interesting question that would take us to the first part of our analysis. What would happen in Venezuela if the sectors responsible of the Caracazo in dispute for power, undoubtedly allied to the international right, come back? Will they ask rescue to the IMF? Let's look at Macri's Argentina, Moreno's Ecuador. Are they forcing the barriers, betting on the re-edition of a Caracazo? Because it's the same actors who adopted these measures that led to that social explosion as Caracazo. We will review it and analyze more in depth with our guest after this first pause.
Van a tratar de alargar, buscando la explosión.
Seeking for an explosion.
Solo que aquí, esa
Only
explosión no va a ocurrir.
that explosion will not happen here.
Esa fue la causa del
That was the cause of the Caracazo. The only ones who can cause an explosion here are popular masses. Venezuela, 30 years after Caracazo, revolution and resisting revolution. We must say that Caracazo was the first popular spontaneous rebellion against the harshest face of neoliberalism. It was expanded to the continent. Let's look at a quick summary. In 1989, Latin America and the Caribbean was crossed and determined by violence in Central America and social and economic crisis in the South Cone, and with the recent dictatorships that persecuted, killed, and made people flee from the countries. In the 80s, the White House sent to El Salvador $1 million to kill 70,000 people. Nicaragua was economically destroyed with the CIA penetration in its history and blockade to its economy. The Guatemalan Air Forces, with the Sanguinarian School of the Americas, performed one of the largest genocides known with families. And Mexico, PRI, implemented the recipes of the IMF. 20,000 soldiers of the U.S. Army invaded Panama to capture General Manuel Noriega, successor of Omar Torrijos. Argentina was undergoing very high inflation with Carlos Menem, and Chile was leaving the dictatorship of Pinochet, but preserved the neoliberal government imposed by the right wing. Europe was undergoing a series of rebellions that ended the Soviet Union. Let's go to Sputnik, Russian agency today. 30 years after Caracazo, starting point of progressivism in Latin America. As of these facts, Latin America started a cycle of popular struggles that continued on February 4th, 1992, when Hugo Chavez led a civic military rebellion with young people in the Maracaibo headquarters. Since he was unable to control the situation in the capital, he surrendered and sent a message of hope to the Venezuelan people, and among other things said that the country has to take a better future and be responsible, which was historic because that had not happened before in history, at least not in the Fourth Republic. Let's analyze now with Felix Roque, political analyst, professor and constitutional lawyer. Thank you for being here. We were saying that popular Venezuelan in Venezuela was the spark that started the engine of the revolution that still goes on until now, and that years later created Chavism, understood as a movement, and also one decade of progressive and left-wing governments in America. Yes, 3 years ago I visited San Francisco de Yare, and I was honored to visit the jail where Commander Hugo Chavez Frias was arrested, and I talked to the workers of a plant, local plant, on these events. I was saying that perhaps much of what President Chavez later, when he won the election, started implementing was born there. But it was Caracazo, the genesis of that action, that 3 years later, 1989, a day like today, February 27, allowed the group of young militaries that had sworn to carry out a heroic revolutionary journey against a corrupt government as such of Carlos Andrés Pérez. In a massive demonstration, President Chavez said it in this way. One of so many times he described what, for him as a leader of a revolution, the facts of the February 27 and 28 of 1989 meant, and the days later until March. We must say that on February 27, facts accelerated. It was a catalyzer for the rebellion of the people. It promoted patriotic militaries, and on February 4th of 1992, 3 years later, we went out to answer the people of February 27th. To verify our hypothesis, Professor, is the oligarchy trying for 4 years or a little more? I would say that as of the death of President Hugo Chavez, they are creating the conditions to re-edit Caracazo, paradoxically, because it's a sector that ideologically is included in the project that historically took measures of this type. I think that that paradox is not applicable here. If we go back to what was happening in 1989, the situation with the president was non-comparable. We can say that for 1989, Venezuela had 80% poverty and 20% critical poverty. We had unemployment levels above 20%, and of course, package of neoliberal measures presented by then-Minister Miguel Rodriguez to comply with IMF and World Bank. They had to segregate the state and deliver it to the international capital. We must remember that in order to obtain a loan or renegotiate our internal debt, we were forced to privatize great corporations of the country, increase taxes, gasoline price, and this was that lit the people, the increase of 100% of gasoline, and also, paradoxically, a reduction of wages and also pensions. The plan was such that the Washington Consensus had defined as a recipe to be applied in Venezuela. What is curious about and cynical about this is how then President Carlos Andrés Pérez presented the bonanza of that plan to the country. And the people spontaneously, with nobody organizing it, came out, and this expansive wave exponentially was extended throughout the country. And finally, the facts we know. Minister Izaguirre was pathetic in the cameras. He was unable to end his message because the number of people murdered by the army and the security corps and were piled on that street, remember. Well, when President Chavez came out on February 4, 1992, started struggling against all that, and when he won the elections, Chavez vindicated the people. Therefore, to pretend to say that in front of this current economic war and threats from the empire and criminal and war acts that they have committed against us, of course, the people is answering as we are looking at this huge concentration in Petare. Chavism is going back. Many people abroad do not understand how, if it's true, there's no food, the people does not rebel, but there are millions in favor of Maduro because they have a level of awareness that and it understands that in these 20 years the people have earned conquest. We have a very different situation than 1992 that guarantees everything to Venezuelans because there's civic military union, which is the core of this government, and we have had the response we all know: braveness, courage, patriotism, and not allowing Venezuelan flags to be delivered abroad. It's a brave country that is struggling, unlike what they are saying, and they do not kneel before the empire. Now, there are some data that we think are important to describe these historic agents. It was until December 11, 1999, that the Inter-American Human Rights Court recognized violation of rights to life, to judicial guarantees, etc. We must remember that it was decreed, and as you said, there were common graves, corpses that have still not been recognized, and it was only when the revolution arrived that they started recognizing the victims. Paradoxically, the military Chavez that many people called a dictatorship took a step that was historically important, and he assumed the violation and that responsibility and vindicated descendant men and women of those who were murdered in the jail. So that's why we said that the constitutional text that was largely made by Commander Chavez is the word of a government to recognize human rights, to stop that from happening again. This is why the calls of some people doing for military intervention by the United States, we must remember hundreds thousands of people dead just because they refused to apply the Washington Consensus Plan to invade Venezuela. At that time, Miguel Rodriguez called this, and the people rebelled, organized them en masse. Right now, there is a government that has avoided war and is calling to peace. This is why the question of similarity between one another, I think there is none. There are different conditions, the political, economic, social conditions. But in March 1989, the president of the Venezuelan Central Bank announced that the state assumed the private debt, and the seventh, inflation arrived 84% as a result of that, and even so, the economic program remained untouched, and the price of coffee increased to 50–60%. In Venezuela, there is an induced inflation process, so this is why I'm asking if the right wing is creating the conditions, and according to Garcini's article, they have kidnapped the concept of revolution and are trying to mimetize to give their strategy a popular pace. What happened in 1989 was a clear academic plan, a neoliberal plan, and we know what neoliberalism proposes. The invisible hand of the market will rule everything. Supply and demand will tell us the future of the currency business. Right now, there's an economic war that pretends to take away our wealth. They have kidnapped more than $30 billion, and in general, the loss of the country exceeds $350 billion. So the plan is different. Before, they were seeking to impose a neoliberal plan to strengthen the neoliberal state. At this time, they are seeking to overthrow a revolutionary government so it would be a neoliberal program 1989 versus an economic war in the times of revolution. Yes, and sometimes it calls my attention, those who ignore that after the seizure of our assets and robbery in Germany, our impossibility of negotiating, as Arreaza said in the UN Security Council, where we had a second significant victory yesterday against Michael Pompeo. It is clear that if there's something right now, it is the search of a government that does not agree with imperial ideas, neoliberal ideas, and that understands that the wealth must be redistributed in favor of the people. Talking about neoliberalism and programmatic differences, Enrique Tejera París, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Times, said from Quito on March 6th that demonstrations had been maximized throughout the world because they did not unstabilize democracy or create economic damage. While Milagros Mendoza said that we must not lose time in the causes of social explosion, we have to sacrifice ourselves working more. There's no other alternative. That tells us what kind of people people was in government. Well, the president at the time even said a sadder thing, that the huge amount of wounded people in death was due to breaking all the stores. It was not the bullets, the bombs, what had killed them, but the glasses of the bakeries and small stores. That could not be more cynical. Do you think that the right wing could retake power in this dispute against the Bolivarian Revolution? We will ask for your answer after this pause. We want to talk about Latin American left wing versus conservative restoration in our region. We'll be back with Professor Felix Roque and another guest we will have to analyze this.
Venezuela,
30 years from the Caracazo resisting revolution. We were talking of an expansive wave. It was not only the renewal of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela that meant some kind of early beginning. In December 2001, in Argentina saw Argentinazo as a consequence of neoliberal policies under the presidents of Carlos Menas that privatized public companies, dismissals, and a deep economic crisis. The imposition of Corralito restricted circulation of money in banks for more than 1 year. Fernando Larrua, president, resigned, and there were several weeks of instability where the country had 5 presidents and was declared in the foreign debt was declared in default. President Menem resigned his candidacy, which automatically turned Nestor Kirchner in elected president with 22.2% of votes. In 12 years of government of Nestor and Cristina Kirchner, poverty was reduced and unemployment. And the free trade agreement was rejected and fully paid the debt to the IMF. In the case of Brazil, progressivism was an answer to decades of military and neoliberal policies. Ignacio Lula da Silva became candidate to the president on 3 occasions, 1989, 1994, and 1998. It was in 2002 as a candidate of the Workers' Party PT when he won. During his 8 years as president, Lula socially and economically transformed Brazil. His social program, Zero Hunger, contributed to take around 30 million people out of poverty in barely 1 decade. In Bolivia, in January and April, several demonstrations took place against the privatization of the municipal water services. Indigenous and peasant populations were asphyxiated by multinationals that increased the water consumption. This took Evo Morales to the presidency in 2005 with the Movimiento al Socialismo. Evo became the first indigenous president of that nation. After he was elected, Bolivia became one of the best countries with the best development in the country, with unemployment and poverty being drastically reduced. He recognized the rights of originary peoples in the plurinational state constitution enacted in 2009. We continue analyzing with Felix Roque, political analyst, a lawyer, and on this side of the table we have Jorge Laderas, politologist. He has a master's degree in philosophy of war in the Bolivarian University, political analyst in the fourth war generation. Welcome. Jorge, during the weekend on the right wing failed in the attempt of passing by force alleged humanitarian aid on the border of Brazil and Colombia. The next step of the hemispheric coalition against Venezuela was a new meeting of the Group of Lima in Bogota, curiously enough with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. They did not reach a consensus for a military intervention. We're talking about current facts and how they are trying to assault Venezuela by any way. Yes, the move they tried to make on February 23 was to see the conditions of Venezuela to resist a military assault using unconventional weapons through the so-called humanitarian aid. The response was the mobilization of the people and the civic-military union that also allowed us to resist that attempt. After that, and I have said this many times, came the second phase of the intervention process. I have said that Venezuela is victim of several machineries, the unconventional machineries through non-military elements, private violent services, through diplomacy, economic. They are trying to apply it through the so-called Lima group that sought another aggression against Venezuela. They didn't make it because many peoples of these countries have been pressing with mobilization statements because we know what a war in Venezuela would mean. It would not stay only inside Venezuela. A war in Venezuela would be extended to the continent and have a very negative impact. So there's no consensus because they have weighed the consequences. Yes, internal pressure has not allowed them to accept it. Professor Felix Roque was saying that the Bolivarian Republic in Venezuela had a new success yesterday at the UN Security Council called by the United States that continues to pressure, but Venezuela still has powerful allies with strong geopolitical weight, and Foreign Affairs Minister Arreaza has plenty of arguments. Yes, the speech of Minister Arreaza was wonderful and included all the elements that the great powers are applying against Venezuela. He explained all indicators and data they required, as well as the participation of Russia and China has been essential. Without these two countries yesterday in the Security Council, it gave us the conditions to earn more time and resist. Minister Arreaza said that the U.S. pretensions to repeat its condition of colonial controller in the continent through violence and recover its backyard as a source of natural resources for its economic apparatus. And Venezuela responds with sovereignty. The Russian representative also made a detailed report of what Commander Chavez did, more than 350 million that the blockade has made us lose. So what the Security Council is discussing is internal security of Venezuela and possible intervention, unilateralism and multilateralism. Venezuela is putting the stakes on multilateralism, and United States has implemented unilateralism with unilateral sanctions. They have embargoed Venezuelan assets. Professor Felix, I would like to talk about the political international arenas and the Caribbean's posture expressed in the inter-sectional meeting of CARICOM that took place yesterday, that were talking in favor of the non-interference. Our community is proud of our position, and we are eager to help the people of Venezuela. Dialogue is the only way to impede a catastrophe in the borders. Definitely, these countries are a protective shield for the continent. It's very important because our peers of CARICOM have been constant in this position, political position of recognition of President Maduro as the legitimate president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And looking at these events, the Group of Lima has an ambiguous position because they would not support any military action against Venezuela. This was declared in the Security Council, and of course this is an important step in this case. And France's position surprised me a lot because France refused to support an intervention against our country. All this clearly shows that the warlike militarist attitude of the United States is not supported. And this is why when everybody's meeting with, or Trump is meeting with the North Korean president, perhaps he is talking about different aspects other than Venezuela, because if something has happened in Venezuela, has shown a dignified and sovereign position, and Latin American countries have understood that an intervention against Venezuela would affect the rest of the countries. It already happened in 1962 with the famous crisis of the missiles in Cuba. The response was the Agrarian Reform and Alliance for Progress, because Kennedy and his advisors knew that war against Cuba would have created problems around Latin America, a place they have called always as their backyard. Venezuela today is a nation, and this has to be acknowledged. The efforts made by President Chavez and continue by President Maduro, as well as Minister Arreaza. And Venezuela, that is a small, modest country, is showing that it has proud people, and inside the territory there is the international encounter with the peoples of Venezuela. So is Venezuela alone, isolated? Well, here we have a practical demonstration. I would like to ask both if Chavism is the largest moral reserve threatened by the hegemony of that vision of the world. Today, Chavism and the Venezuelan Revolution is an expression, is an important model of how to do politics besides the people, of how to account for it to the people. And I think this is what is a threat to the U.S. empire, that this revolution that projects positive things for the people expands, as happened with citizens' revolution in Ecuador, governments of Kirchner in Argentina, the current revolution of Bolivia, and the presence of President Lula in Brazil, the presence of Ortega and our peers from Nicaragua, of course with historic presence of Cuba. The empire and his allies fears that this revolution consolidates and multiplies. They want they fear democratic, revolutionary, participative governments where our expressions of power, including the army, are very different from theirs. I ask the same. Venezuela was the answer to the neoliberal thesis Francisco Culián, who in 1989 And Venezuela was the arisal of an alternative in Venezuela after everything was lost with the fall of the Soviet Union. Venezuela has become the light that gives the possibility, Latin America the possibility of having a genuine thought of Simón Bolívar, the great nation. And Venezuela is a moral reserve because it has shown resistance. Unlike Chile, we have 20 years resisting. And it's also a political reference because we have built a new participative model. Venezuela is also an ideological and political model because after 30 years of Caracazo, the people are not mobilizing for participation and social equality. They are defending a revolution that protects them. They defend a revolution that guarantees sovereignty. Venezuela finally is the best example of sovereignty and self-determination of the peoples that remain firm in the most difficult circumstances. Jorge Felix, professors, I would like to thank you for being with us, and we go to our conclusions. February 27, 1989, the application of a clearly neoliberal program in Venezuela after one of the last governments characterized by torture and repression. It was also the genesis of the popular Bolivarian anti-imperialist revolution that is still on foot today in spite of the serious attempts of asphyxiate it. And that they pretend to read at those conditions, but the contexts are different and places a paradox that we were developing. An unconventional war is being applied with different elements, non-military, economic instability combined with warlike maneuvers with significant consequences if they apply it, because they are just threats here. So Venezuela confronts a civilization crisis where the values built in the history of humanity, solidarity, equality, have been replaced by capitalism, by consumptivism, selfishness. And this is what is happening at this time. We have ended our critical moment. Thank you for being with us.